Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. Today is episode 10 of Azure Zero to Hero series, and in this video we will learn command line interface for Azure, or also known as Azure CLI. We will start with understanding what exactly is Azure CLI. When does a DevOps engineer use Azure CLI over Azure console? That means from day 1 to day 9, whenever we had to create resources on the Azure platform, we always used Azure console. But when does a DevOps engineer and why DevOps engineers use Azure CLI? We will also learn that. After that, I'll explain you how to install, download, and configure Azure CLI. It can be on Windows, Linux, or macOS. Don't worry, I'll show you how to download, install, and configure. Then we will proceed with creating resources on the Azure platform. For that, I have chosen some resources which we have learned. So we will create resource group, we will create virtual machine, virtual network, and storage account. These are some of the concepts that we have learned. Once we create them, towards the end of this video, we'll also delete those resources using Azure CLI. Finally, we'll discuss about some DevOps engineers use cases with respect to Azure CLI. Also, references, so that in future, if you have to create any resources on the Azure platform, how can you create them? So this is going to be the video. It's going to be very interesting. You don't need to have any prior knowledge on the scripting. So please watch this video till the end. One thing to mention before we start with the video is if you are looking for the notes for the episodes of this series, so everything will be uploaded to the same GitHub repository. There are day-wise folders. For example, today is day 10. So if you click on this day 10 folder, you have the notes that I am going to cover in today's video. Of course, these notes will not have everything that I am talking in the video, but they can be used as a revision material. So start this repository so that you get the continuous updates to the documentation changes that I'm making to the repo. So let's proceed and use Azure CLI. Let's start with understanding why should someone actually learn Azure CLI when there is something already called as Azure Console. Because Azure Console has a very good user interface and they also have a great user experience. Let's say if I have to create a virtual machine, it's very simple. I just have to navigate to the virtual machines service, click on the create button, and by providing few details, I get my virtual machine resource. It's very simple. Anybody can learn it. Then why should I actually go for Azure CLI? So the answer to it is that if you have to create one virtual machine, yeah, that's fine. You can just go to the user interface and you can create that. But when you have to perform some quick actions, okay, as a DevOps engineer, you deal with a lot of projects. Let's say you are dealing with some 10 projects and you just want to quickly check what are the resource groups that are assigned to a particular project. Or you just quickly want to check how many virtual machines are being used by a particular project, or how many AKS clusters are being used by a particular project. Now, every time if you have to log into the user interface and navigate to those resources and try to find them, it takes some time. And the other thing is automation. Let's say you want to create some 10 virtual machines, or let's say you want to create a stack where you want to create a AKS cluster plus virtual network plus a file storage resource, and you want to use this file storage resource for the AKS pods or the Kubernetes pods. Then this is some huge amount of configuration, right? You are talking about creating multiple resources. Now this might take time. When you are creating this entire configuration through the user interface, let's say it takes 30 minutes. And the number of things that you have to be careful with, like when you are creating AKS cluster, you have to be very careful that you don't miss any particular field. So let's say you took some 30 minutes for it. And once you have created this, after 10 days, there is another project called Project XYZ, and they came up with exact same requirement. Even they have requested for AKS cluster plus VNet plus file storage service, file storage resource. Then again, you will spend some 30 minutes. But instead of that, if you use some commands or scripting using Azure CLI, then you can automate your repetitive task. And you can also perform some quick actions. I'll tell you how. Let's take the same example. We are talking about a requirement that a particular project has, where they want to create a virtual network plus a Kubernetes cluster on the Azure platform, plus they want to create a file storage resource for the AKS pods. Now, if you execute these things using Azure CLI commands rather than using the Azure user interface or the Azure portal, first time you will take time to figure out what these commands are. And let's say you did it also in some 30 minutes. But the advantage is that you can store these commands in a Git repository and you can share this with your team members. Now, not just you, but even any other team members, if they receive such request, now they know that, okay, I don't have to go to the user interface. I can simply go to the file that is uploaded by Abhishek in the Git repository. So I'll clone this Git repository, just modify the names or something, and I will execute them. Probably it will take some 5 to 10 minutes. Resource creation might take a lot of time on the console, but the time that you are spending will be reduced. Even if there is a new team member that comes to your team, even for them, you can share the Git repository and you can tell them that, okay, if in future you get a Jira request for creation of such resources, then you can use this particular repository where we have already automated things. The most important thing that you have to understand is the quick actions and the automation. Now you might ask me, Abhishek, are there any other ways you can also automate? Yes, not just Azure CLI. We have ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager templates. There is something called Terraform. There are multiple other ways where you can automate things on the Azure platform without using user interface. You can create the resources in different ways. But in today's class, let's restrict our topic to just CLI. So if it comes to CLI, why should you use? One is for running very quick actions. If I have to just, like, in very quick time, if I want to understand what are the resources that a particular team is using, I don't have to log in and I don't have to search on the user interface. I'll just fire some commands, AZ something, we will learn. And using that, you will get the required resources that you are looking for. A particular project, how many resources they are using, you can quickly get them. Or you also want to create some resource, right? Immediately you can do it by firing some AZ commands. You want to delete, you can fire some AZ commands and you can get them. Second thing is automation and also reducing the errors. How can you reduce errors? Very simple, right? If you are using user interface, let's say every time if I have to create all the resources that I discussed about, virtual machine plus AKS cluster plus storage account plus a file sharing resource, then the problem is that probably when I'm doing it, I might miss a particular field. I have to do it 10 times, I have to do it 15 times. Then one or the other time, I might miss some simple thing, and that leads to configuration errors. And that configuration error, to debug and troubleshoot, you will take a lot of time. Let's say I know how to create a virtual machine, but for some reason, what I did was I picked up a wrong image. Because I have to do it repetitively. 10 people are asking for it, 15 people are asking for it. I also might do some mistakes. So instead of picking up one image, I picked up a different image. Then the problem is that you created some configuration mistake, and to debug that configuration mistake, you spend a lot of time. You can reduce those things if you have created Azure CLI commands, and if you store them somewhere, next time people can easily use them. All that they have to do is change some names or change some fields. So these are the advantages of using Azure CLI. Now let's see how to actually download, install, and configure Azure CLI. So just search for Azure CLI documentation and click on the first link that you see, Azure Command Line Interface CLI Overview. To your left side, you have this option called Install, Update, and Run. So Azure documentation is very good. Like if you click on the install button, you have different pages for Windows installation, Mac OS, and Linux. Many of you might be on Windows, so let's start with Windows. Click on the Windows option, and here you have Microsoft Installer, Microsoft Installer with PowerShell, and Windows Package Manager. I won't be recommending this because if you are using an old version of Windows, this might not work. So go with Microsoft Installer or Microsoft Installer with PowerShell. If you want to go with this, then you need to have PowerShell and you have to copy this command, execute it on your laptop. If your PowerShell does not have permissions, then again, you might run into some errors. So the easy way is just go with Microsoft Installer. Click on 32-bit or 64-bit. I think most of you these days might be using 64-bit. So go with this one. Click on the 64-bit option. If you want to look at which one are you using, go to the system preferences and you will find whether you are using 32-bit or 64-bit. So click on the latest release for Azure CLI 64-bit. And when you do that, this gets downloaded. Like you see here, this MSI getting downloaded on my machine. Once this installation is complete, just click on that particular installed MSI and provide the permissions for it. Provide next, and then your Azure CLI for Windows is installed. We are just installing for now. Okay, I'll come to the configuration part. Then if you are looking at Mac OS, just execute the brew command that is provided here. It's very simple. Like I'm using a Mac terminal. So I'll just copy this command, and if I go to my terminal, just provide this brew update and brew install Azure CLI. Take some time, probably, let's say it might take some 2 minutes or 3 minutes if you are doing it for the first time, because it has to update some packages. All that you have to do to install is just run this command. So if you see here, it is downloading some packages through curl and it is installing. You don't have to do anything additional more than this. If you want to do it on Linux, again, depending upon the distribution that you're using, if you're using Ubuntu or CentOS, depending upon what you're using, just provide these options, right? So let's say if I'm using apt, that is Ubuntu. So scroll down, you have the command. So just copy paste this command and Microsoft Azure CLI for your Ubuntu distribution is downloaded and installed. The most important part is, okay, installation is pretty straightforward. How do I actually configure it? So for that, what you need to do is, let me pull my terminal. So once you install, if you execute this command called az version, you need to see the output something like this. So when you run this command az version, you will get the output where Azure returns you the version of Azure CLI that you have installed. And this indicates that the Azure CLI is properly installed on your machine. If you are using Windows, then go with PowerShell. So Azure has great support with PowerShell. If you are using AWS or any other cloud provider, then I would have recommended Git Bash. But because Microsoft is the one that owns Azure, they have very good support with Windows machines and also PowerShell. So you can use PowerShell if you are trying to do anything with the Microsoft Azure platform. Specifically with Azure CLI, PowerShell is great, so you can use that. Even in PowerShell, if you execute this command, az version, you have to get the output. Only then your Azure CLI is properly installed. After this, okay, I have installed it. Now, how do I configure? That is, how can I integrate the Azure CLI that is downloaded on my laptop with the Azure account? For that, you simply have to run this command, az login. So when you do az login, immediately you will see this pop-up where Azure will ask you to sign in to your Azure console. So use the Azure account. You have to use the same Azure account. And then you will get this particular thing called you have logged in to Microsoft Azure. Okay, so now I have installed Azure CLI. I have configured Azure CLI. Now let's proceed with creating resources on the Azure platform. But how to do it, right? So for that, again, you can go to the Azure CLI documentation. And in this, there is a section called Learn Azure CLI. If you click on this, there is this great page, which is called as article list A to Z, where anything that you want to create on the Azure platform, they have the references and the commands. Let's say I want to create virtual machine. Just perform Control F or CMDF and just search for AZVM. I want to create virtual machine. I search for AZVM. And when I click on this, then they have pages for what exactly you want to do. Let's say I want to create virtual machine. Then click on this button, create a virtual machine on a virtual network. And if I scroll down, I also get the commands. But of course, there is one thing that you need to do more, or one you need to learn before doing this. Like if I directly copy paste this thing, I'll get an error because there are some mandatory fields that you have to create even before virtual machine. That's why you need to be familiar with Azure user interface. Or before automating things, you need to be familiar with how to create that resource using the user interface. I'll give you a basic example. If I have to create a virtual machine, right, I can simply go here. I can copy paste this command, but there are some mandatory fields for the virtual machine, like resource group. Resource group is a mandatory thing. Even before creating virtual machine, even if you have seen that in day 4, before creating virtual machine, I have actually created a resource group. So there will be some dependencies for the resources. Like if I just copy paste this command, it will fail because I don't have a resource group at all. Let's say I don't have a resource group at all for now. Then this will fail. So that's why you need to have a prior knowledge. You cannot just directly start with Azure CLI. Even that is the reason why we have put this in the day 10. I could have put this in day 2 or day 3. But the problem is that if you don't know how to use the Azure platform, then automation using CLI is not easy. So if I have to create virtual machine, now what I'm going to do is firstly go back to the terminal and first create the resource group. You might say that Abhishek, subscription is also there. When you perform AZ login, we have already used the subscription. That is when you perform AZ login, then Azure has already picked up your subscription. So now this AZ, the one that is on your laptop, already knows that, okay, Abhishek is using the free trial account and everything that I'm going to do is on the free trial subscription. So you don't have to do this additionally. How to create resource group? Same thing. If you know the order of resources, then using Azure CLI is very easy. Now I'll just similarly how I search for Azure virtual machine. What I'll do is I'll just go back to this A to Z page and here I'll search for resource group. How to manage Azure resource groups with Azure CLI. And here, if you scroll down, there is this page which explains create a resource group. So it has provided the command. Let me take this. Let me go back, paste it here. It says AZ group means resource group, create. Let's provide a name for the resource group. So because we are learning Azure CLI, everything that I want to create, let's put it in a resource group called Learning Azure CLI. You can put any name just for having all of these things in one resource group, and simply I can delete that resource group once I learn Azure CLI or I just practice something. Location, let's keep it as East US. Now let's create this. Okay, as soon as I create this, you will see that learning Azure CLI, this resource group should be available on my Azure console. So let's see, we will navigate to resource groups. Here we have, let me try to refresh. So here I have learning Azure CLI resource group. Now, next thing that I want to do is create virtual machine. So what I'm going to do is go back to this again, go back to the A to Z page, and in the A to Z page, search for AZ VM. Create virtual machine on a virtual network. So this one is going to create virtual machine as well as virtual network for me. So I don't have to create virtual network additionally. Copy this. Again, if you are using PowerShell, please copy this one, not the one that I'm showing, because I'm using a Mac, which is similar to the Bash. So I can use these commands. If you are on PowerShell, you have to use this. Only thing that differs is you have to copy paste this, and I will copy paste this one. So just copy, and now I'll clear the screen, put these ones. In the resource group, whatever the resource group I have created before this, learning Azure CLI, virtual machine name. So the virtual machine name, let's call it as test CLI virtual machine. Let's keep the image as Ubuntu. I don't want to change it because I know this is also in the free trial subscription. So let me put that. Virtual network, it will be created. So you can give again something like test CLI VNet. Subnet, let me call it as example subnet. This will also be created. And all of these things will be created under this resource group only, called Learning Azure CLI. Generate SSH keys. So what happens here is you will also find that in the Azure documentation. On your laptop, if you already have SSH keys, okay? So if you are using Linux-like environment, so if you have installed the SSH package, there will be a private public key, or you can also run SSH keygen. But what this particular field does is, if you have SSH keys on your laptop, it will use those SSH keys. If you don't have, it will generate the SSH keys. So either ways, you don't have to worry. Okay. So execute this command. On my laptop, I definitely have the SSH keys because I use it for multiple purpose. So the VM that gets created, it will be created using this particular public key. See, it is also providing the location. It is saying that, okay, I will use this public key because I already see a public key on your laptop. So now if I have to log into that virtual machine, I have to use the private key of this public key. If you don't have it, don't worry. No problem. It will be created and generated. If you go to PowerShell, right? So here it is generating SSH keys. If you don't have, probably if you are using Windows, you don't have the keys most of the times. So it will create the SSH keys for you. Now this might take some time. Let's say it takes some 2 minutes. But after that, if you go to the resource group, you will find all the resources such as VNet, you will find virtual machine. And the beautiful thing here is that you don't have to worry about the resource creation. While it is getting executed, you can perform some other task. As a DevOps engineer, you might have multiple tasks. So while this is getting executed, you can do some other activity. You can probably work on your CI/CD pipelines or any other thing. And now that I have created these things, I can just copy paste this thing. Before this, I have created a resource group. I'll put that in a Git file, just like I did here, right? I want to share the knowledge with you people. So what I've done, in the Day-10, I've created this folder called Create Virtual Machine, and I've written all the steps. Now, if you people want to execute the creation of virtual machine, you don't have to go to the documentation, right? Because if we are working in a team, I have already created, you can simply come here, copy paste these commands, and your virtual machine with virtual network and everything is created, right? So this is the advantage basically. So it says virtual machine is created. Let's see if it got created or not. Let me search for virtual machine. Perfect. Test CLI virtual machine is created. Now go back to your resource group, and here you will find all the resources that you have created. So if you go to the resource group, learning Azure CLI resource group, so you have the virtual network that got created, subnet that got created, public IP, NSG, and virtual machine. Let's say you have performed all of these things, and now you just want to delete them. So again, you can come to the user interface, use this resource group, click on the delete resource group action, or you can use the terminal as well. So this is the command az group delete. I have taken this from the same page, and here I'll just say learning Azure CLI. In my case, I created something called learning Azure CLI, but on the GitHub, I provided the resource group as learn Azure CLI. So change the command as per what is your requirement. Okay, if you have created the resource group with some other name, just provide that name. And now it will delete all the resources. Okay, it will take some time because it has to delete the resources. There is another thing where you can also provide -- no wait to this particular command. So you don't have to wait for the execution to be completed. Right now, my terminal is waiting for the execution to be complete. Similarly, if you want to create a storage account. So again, I'll go back to the A to Z article and I'll just search for storage account. Let me search for AZ storage account. It will be much easier, just like we did for virtual machine, AZ VM. So similarly, I search for AZ storage account. And here I want to create storage account. So I'll search for it. Create a storage account. Now, if you scroll down, there are multiple options where the documentation explains, do you want to create it through portal or something? Click on the Azure CLI option. Now here it explains, if you scroll down, first install the Azure CLI. We have already done it. Then it says perform AZ login. We have already done it. Then if you scroll down, it explains you that create a resource group, which we have already done. Let's use the same resource group. If you have deleted it, yeah, in my case, I have already deleted it. So you can either recreate the resource group. So use the same command. And let's say I run this particular command, AZ group create, and let's use the same resource group. Okay, the one that we have just deleted. Let's call it as Azure. What was that? Learn Azure CLI. Make sure the resource group that you have created previously got deleted, or don't delete the resource group. But you have to just make sure that the resource group does not exist anymore when you are creating it. So now the resource group is again created. And just scroll down, copy paste this command. Okay, so now just clear the screen, copy paste this one where AZ storage account create, provide the name of the storage account, resource group. We have changed this to Azure CLI, learn Azure CLI. So change this accordingly. Location, it's okay. Let's keep it East US. You don't have to change these things, right? And just run the command and your storage account is also created. So this is how we use Azure CLI, and spend some time on the CLI documentation. And as you start working on the Azure in real time, you will read through the documentation multiple times for your day-to-day activities. So you'll get better at it. Right now, initially when you are doing it, you might find some trouble in searching because I have done it multiple times. For me, it's very easy to navigate. So that's why try to spend some time on the A to Z article. Just search for Azure CLI documentation and go to learn Azure CLI A to Z document. There, just spend some time, see how the documentation is written, try to execute few things. I've shown you virtual machine and storage account. Probably try to create anything new and see if it is working or not, right? So this is a video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. See you all in the next one.